This week, WDI USA is pleased to announce that this year's national convention, Growing the Women's Liberation Movement, will take place in Indianapolis, Indiana, on September 19th through the 21st. As a Midwesterner, I am particularly excited about this event. We also published a statement that articulates our strong opposition to the NCAA's February 2025 participation policy for transgender student athletes. Our view is that the new policy is out of alignment with Title IX, the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, and both the Executive Order Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports and Executive Order 14168 Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. And our statement urges the NCAA to formulate one that is. Virtually all GC feminist groups, including Icons and XXXY Athletics, are in alignment with our statement. Relatedly, on February 12th, Icons reported that just after the NCAA banned athletes marked male on their birth records from women's competitions, governors moved to cut the time required to change gender markers on birth certificates to as little as 3 business days. Only 6 states prohibit changes entirely. On this same topic, the Wall Street Journal recently published an article by Colin Wright and Ilya Shapiro advocating that Trump issue a new EO requiring states to maintain original birth certificates for federal purposes. As he says on X, sex in humans is immutable, and so documents that reflect a person's sex should also be immutable. Colin's tweet also connects to a video of Bill Bach, the Icons attorney for female athletes suing the NCAA, testifying in support of Indiana Bill HB 1041, which seeks to expand the state's previous ban on boys participating in girls' K-12 sports to college athletics. Quoting Colin, the video exposes the widespread problem of states allowing people to secure their sex by issuing new birth certificates that reflect their gender identity. Last Tuesday, the Department of Education sent a letter to the NCAA and the National Federation of State High School Associations, the NFHS, urging them to restore to female athletes the records, titles, awards, and recognitions misappropriated by males competing in female categories. And on Wednesday, the Department's Office for Civil Rights, OCR, announced investigations into the Minnesota State High School League and the California Interscholastic Federation, both of which publicly announced their intentions to abide by state law as it relates to girls' and women's sports in violation of federal anti-discrimination laws. Both state laws allow athletes to participate on teams based on an individual's subjective gender identity rather than their sex, even though sex is the basis for Title IX protections. The press release further asserts that state laws do not override federal anti-discrimination laws, and these entities and their member schools remain subject to Title IX and its implementing regulations. Last week, I mentioned the Lambda Legal and ACLU-backed lawsuit filed on behalf of pro-gender identity ideology organizations PFLAG, GLAD, and a group of families with confused kids against Trump's Protecting Children and Defending Women EOs, which the suit asserts are unlawful and unconstitutional. On February 13th, a federal judge in Maryland granted plaintiffs' request for a temporary restraining order in the case. The ruling, in effect for 14 days, essentially puts Trump's directive on hold nationwide while the case proceeds, though it could also be extended. And on the 14th, a federal judge in Seattle temporarily blocked enforcement of Trump's Protecting Children EO in the case brought by Democrat attorneys general from the states of Washington, Minnesota, and Oregon, along with 3 Washington doctors, who argue that the executive order violates equal rights protections, the separation of powers, and states' powers to regulate what is not specifically delegated to the federal government. Attorney Glenna Goldis recently posted a detailed thread on X discussing the news that GLAD Law, the ACLU of New Hampshire, and multinational law firm Goodman Proctor have moved to amend a suit originally filed last August on behalf of male soccer players Parker Terrell and Iris Turmel against a New Hampshire state law that mandates sports be segregated by sex in order to challenge Trump's EO protecting single-sex sports. Her breakdown of the complaint is as hilarious as it is informative and definitely worth a read. And finally, in response to Trump's Defending Women directive, the National Park Service has made some welcome changes to its website for the Stonewall National Monument, a park and visitor center in New York commemorating the 1969 Stonewall riot, a pivotal moment in the gay rights movement. While still filled with information about the uprising, the words transgender and queer have been deleted. Additionally, the letters T and Q were cut from various references to the LGBTQ acronym and replaced with phrases such as the LGBT rights movement or LGBT civil rights. As Kara would say, celebrate every win.
On the 13th of February, the Australian Doctors Federation published a statement on gender-affirming medical interventions for children and young people, calling for a ban on all gender reassignment treatment in every Australian state and territory, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery. They ask for a national debate or conversation on how to protect vulnerable adults too, up to the age of 25, and for doctors to stop using the OzPath guidelines in treatment. David Limbrick of the Libertarian Party in Victoria posted a response to Argentina's decree to prohibit gender interventions for minors, laying out the Libertarian position. He said, some people ask why prohibiting gender medicine for minors is justified under libertarian philosophy. Our philosophy revolves around the concepts of consent and the harm principle. I do not believe it is possible to form consent for these procedures for minors. Therefore, intervention is justified. And he likens gender medicine to cosmetic medicine, only for adults, no claims of efficacy, and no taxpayer funding. And he finishes by saying, the reality is that puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and other procedures turn physically healthy children into lifelong patients. This is not like other medicine, which is mostly attempting to heal something. So Australia seems to be getting the most traction at the moment on the question of medicalising children, which is great. We're just not getting a lot of movement on other areas. The major parties are still holding the line in favour of intervention with children, or they're handballing the issue with the claim that the average person isn't concerned with it. Some exceptions include the Liberals in Western Australia and Queensland, but not yet at the federal level or in other states. New South Wales Parliament, its own hate speech bill, following on from the federal law passed last week. Like the federal law, it was motivated publicly by debates over anti-Semitism in Australia, but like the federal bill, it includes the additional clause that puts in the suite of kind of sex and gender-related grounds that trigger hate speech provisions as well. And in the New South Wales bill, that is gender identity, intersex status, HIV or AIDS status, and sexual orientation. So that's as well as race and religion. The minister's statement, interestingly, only references race as a trigger. Australian Feminists for Women's Rights have launched a campaign in the lead up to the federal election this year, asking the major parties to commit to reviewing the Sex Discrimination Act in light of the 2013 changes that removed the meanings of woman and man. They have a website with basic information to educate the public and a tool for writing to MPs with a template letter. So you can visit restorewomensrights.org.au to have a look at that, and if you're in Australia, to use it to contact an MP. And lastly, the annual Brisbane Women's Liberation Conference is coming up again on IWD weekend. So that's the 6th to the 8th of March. Speakers include Renee Gerlich, Susan Hawthorne, Scarlett Moore, Carol Ann from the Lesbian Action Group, and Vaishnavi Sundar. There will be a showing of Vaishnavi's documentary Beyond the Looking Glass as well. So you can email IWD Brisbane Meanjin to attend. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's been sort of like at least two kind of interesting news events in New Zealand this week, and one of them is we've been having Pride celebrations in New Zealand, and the Destiny Church sort of hit the headlines. They're a sort of conservative Christian organisation because they forced their way into the Te Atatu Peninsula Community Centre / library in Auckland, and performed a haka and made a lot of noise, and caused a lot of fear and distress amongst the mothers and small children who were there, who were reportedly crying and reported hearing bangings on the door and walls and things like this. So they were pretty frightened by all that. And there's been a kind of differences of opinion amongst the sort of feminist community and amongst those gender critical people. And of course, the gender critical movement includes a wide range of political views, from conservative Christians through to radical feminists, and everything in between. So it's not surprising that there are differences of views on whether this was supported or not. There have been protests against the drag queen story time for a long time in New Zealand, and obviously it's not exactly a clear-cut issue of freedom of speech, because this is where potential harm could be done to children, both from the message that they could change their sex, and also from the proximity to adult performers who in other parts of their lives are doing quite erotic performances. So there is a fear about the close connection with the children. So there's it's seen as a lack of safeguarding. So it's not a clear-cut freedom of speech issue, although the Free Speech Union does see it that way, and they describe this as a thug's veto being expressed. And there have been parallels drawn with what happened to the women at the Let Women Speak rally in 2023, when women were violently attacked by a mob, and a huge mob of 2,000 people. And again, the behaviour of the trans activists was described at that time by the Free Speech Union as a thug's veto as well. But others would say there's not really a parallel, except the state and the media and all the establishment expressing horror at the actions of Destiny Church, but they didn't really criticise the actions of the trans activists at Albert Park at all. So Destiny Church, as I said, it's a conservative Christian organisation. They're anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-bisexual. They opposed gay marriage with demonstrations at the time. They might have even opposed the homosexual law reform. I'm not quite sure of the back history of that, whether Destiny Church had that name or was around in those days. They want to support sort of save the patriarchal family and get men in their sort of leadership domination roles again. So they're not feminists. So yeah, that hit headlines in any case. Now another important news item is that the police conduct, New Zealand Police Conduct Authority, NZPCA, has just released their report about the policing of Albert Park. What happened at Albert Park in March 2023, when 2,000 trans activists mobbed 200 women who were trying to speak at this Let Women Speak rally when Kelly J. Keane had been invited as a speaker. And as everyone knows, that was absolutely horrific and traumatic event for women. I mean, everyone saw it on the internet, but the mainstream media still hardly reported it at all at the time. And the report actually, if you read it carefully and you scroll down far enough, because the actual report about this whole event starts at page 77 and it's called Appendix A. So if you read it and you see that actually the NZPCA is extremely critical of what the police did and basically says that they basically were completely inadequate in their response. That they were acting on flawed risk assessment in the first place. They were not recognizing the risk, and they made poor decisions the whole way through and didn't respond to the pleas of the women for help. They just continued to stay in their vans and not come out and help them. So it's extremely critical of them. But this report is kind of buried in the overall report, which now is entitled Policing of Public Protests in New Zealand. And they add a couple of other reports as well about some Gaza protests. And so it's kind of buried and you hardly notice it. And what they've come up with is a recommendation that the police should have more powers, which seems to me to be completely illogical. But they want to bring in a law about public protests, which will require people, or at least heavily, or maybe at best encourage them, but at worst force them, making it mandatory, somewhere between those two, to notify the police about a month before they have an event. And if they don't notify, maybe they might be punished, or else they won't get little privileges, whereas those who will report it will get these privileges and get more protection. So the deal is, if you want protection from the police, you have to notify them a long time in advance. And furthermore, you have to do what they tell you, and the police can set the conditions on which they're allowed to have their event. So this comes across to me as a very draconian proposal, and it's kind of completely opposite to what I think would be a suitable response, because in fact, the Let Women Speak women did notify the police several times in advance and were basically ignored when they talked about the risk that they thought might be there. So although it's true that nobody knew exactly how bad that risk was going to be at the beginning, a month beforehand, because the events that unfolded in Australia whipped up all the passion and hatred towards Kelly J. Keane, and so lots of people were trying to stop her coming into the country, and politicians and judges and everyone had a great time saying how dreadful she was. And so this whole system whipped up this hatred and smearing of the women. But this bias has not been included in this IPCA report at all. It's like it never existed, and it's just, the police made a mistake. They didn't realize how bad things were going to be, and so on. So and then they responded poorly, but there's nothing about the bias. And I think that in today's climate, giving the state and police more powers, considering there is so much bias, as we know, against women who stand up for sex-based rights, I think that's would be quite a risk. And it's the same thing with the proposed hate crime legislation at the moment. I think that the fear of gender critical feminists is that this wouldn't be designed in an impartial way, and is likely to put women at risk. So there's that report which came out, which is interesting. And then a smaller news item is about rainbow crossings. And ironically, along with the drag queen story time events, which have been controversial for a number of years in New Zealand now, the rainbow crossings are also quite controversial. The councils around New Zealand love painting them to show their support for LGBTQ, etc. And they're actually not really legal as crossings. They're not legal crossings. There are laws in New Zealand that says crossings can only have white paint on them. I don't even think they have black, because I think the grey of the road makes the black line and the white is the paint. And so they're treated as sort of art objects on the street. But anyway, someone's now calling for a judicial review at the High Court as to the legality of these rainbow crossings, arguing that they could distract drivers, for example, and maybe cause accidents. So that's kind of interesting because the Destiny Church, again, or else its associates and friends, have actually painted over a lot of these rainbow crossings, and then they've been accused of hate crimes, and the police have viewed it that way. But at one time they wanted to prosecute Destiny Church for a hate crime for painting over a rainbow crossing, but they actually couldn't really do it, or it sort of stopped at some point because it was kind of perceived that legally the council, who was their victim, was not a suitable victim to be designated a victim of a hate crime, because the council itself wasn't representing the NZ, whatever you call it, the rainbow community. So that kind of didn't succeed. But with these new hate crime proposals from the Law Commission, that's one of the things they're looking into, thinking, well, how could we manage to prosecute them for a hate crime for such a thing? So anyway, so that's the three events that I'm drawing attention to this week. Thank you.